When the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, first heard Pharaoh's order to murder the infant sons of the Hebrew people, I wonder if they felt this order as an affront to their very existence. To be a midwife is to stand at the precipice of life and death. It is to witness the world in its precise moment of becoming one unrepeatable and precious life at a time. When I listen to the text description of these midwives fearing God, this is exactly what comes to mind. Their daily lives brought them face to face with the inherent profundity and dignity and preciousness of each and every life. How could they, the very people tasked with ushering the tender newness of life into the world, be the ones ordered to take it away? This, I would argue, was one of the fatal miscalculations of Pharaoh's plan. But there was another fatal miscalculation. As someone brought up in text study, Pharaoh orders only the death of infant boys. He fears the men that they would one day become and the movement they might mobilize against his cruel regime. Pharaoh fears the men when it is in fact the women who ultimately undermine his rule. When it is in fact the women who subvert his death-dealing order and mobilize a movement that ends his cruel regime. As liberation theologian Kelly Nkandea writes, there would be no Moses, no crossing of the Red Sea, no breaking of the chains of slavery if it weren't for the women of the Exodus narrative, if it weren't for Shiphrah and Puah, Moses' mother and sister, and Pharaoh's daughter. Certainly, this says something about patriarchy, but it also says something about power itself. It says something about how humble the power to transform our lives truly is. It says something about how even the smallest acts of courage and compassion can ripple out in ways that we might never imagine. When Shiphrah and Puah refused to follow Pharaoh's order, when they cleverly lied to protect the Hebrew women giving birth, I doubt that they felt powerful in any empire-overturning sense of the word. As someone in text study pointed out, perhaps all they knew was not so much their power to initiate some grand outcome of resistance. Perhaps all they knew was their power to make a decision right in front of them, a decision between right and wrong. In this instance, their decision had a cascading impact far beyond their own lives. Moses' mother, Yochebed, gives birth and hides Moses away for as long as she can before setting him in a reed basket upon the Nile in the hopes that he might be delivered somewhere where he can live free from the death sentence of his birth. When Yochebed set that fragile baby boy in a basket, I imagine that not only did she not feel powerful in any empire-overturning sense of the word, I imagine she felt great fear. What would become of her child? Even if the river carried him all the way to Pharaoh's palace, would he be allowed to live? Would her daughter Miriam, who protectively followed the basket to its destination, be caught and punished for this act of defiance? Yochebed couldn't have known with any certainty or perhaps any confidence what the outcome of her actions would be that day, but she knew that the outcome of her inaction would be certain death for her son. She chose the possibility, however improbable, that her son might be delivered to freedom. And contained within her hope for Moses' own life was the seed of something far greater, the seed of liberation for an entire people. And then there's Pharaoh's daughter. Her compassion becomes the fertile ground where liberation takes root. She draws Moses out of the water like a midwife drawing new life from the waters of birth. And her heart knows precisely what act of desperation led this child to the riverbank on which she walks. Her defiance of Pharaoh no doubt carried its own risk, but like Shiphrah and Puah, she saw the decision right in front of her And in choosing to recognize Moses' own humanity, she helped set in motion a struggle for the humanity of the entire Hebrew people. Someone in text study pointed out that the Hebrew word used to describe the basket in which Yochebed places Moses is the same word used to describe the ark that God calls Noah to build before the flood. These are the only two stories in Hebrew scriptures in which this word, teva, is used. And in both stories, it is ordinary, fragile, and flawed people who become the vessels of salvation for humanity, who become vessels where hope for a future that might look something more like the love and dignity for which God created us becomes possible. In the story of Exodus, it is these fragile web of choices. It is these small acts of courage and compassion that ripple out in ways that transform the world. And that is a message I think we desperately need to hear today as we live through our own regime built on scapegoating immigrant populations, a regime that is cruel and calloused and all too willing to put innocent lives in the crosshairs. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he reminds us that if we want to live with the kind of courageous belief in the power to transform the world that Christ lived, we cannot allow the broken ways of our world to shape and mold us. We cannot conform to the callousness and cruelty reflected to us by whatever regime happens to hold power in the times that we live. In the Message translation of Romans, this verse reads, "Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking, without even questioning what is truly right and wrong." We all know all too well that there are many narratives of conformity that we are called to question. And perhaps one of the most important to resist right now is conformity to a narrative of disempowerment and cynicism, the belief that what we do does not and could not truly make a difference. As Sue preached last Sunday, whether we like it or not, we are the ones we've been waiting for. That doesn't mean that every act of justice we hope to see will happen, not in our lifetime, certainly. To claim that we are the ones we've been waiting for doesn't mean that we will see racism eradicated or poverty ended or the military-industrial complex dismantled or patriarchy replaced by a true equality of gender expression. It means that when the moral gravity of moments like Pharaoh's order come knocking at our door, when our Supreme Court legalizes racial profiling in the process of deportation, when ICE murders people in the streets, we are called to remember that even our smallest choices and actions of resistance can ripple out in ways we might never imagine. Because what if Shifra and Pua hadn't believed they could make a difference in even one life? What if Rosa Parks hadn't sat down in the middle row of a city bus in Alabama on December 1st, 1965? What if Mary Banatu hadn't taken on the civil rights case that resulted in making Massachusetts the first state to legalize same-sex marriage? What if Joyce Braun hadn't made a stand as one of the first water protectors against the Keystone Pipeline? What if Emily Marp hadn't entered into the fray of public advocacy, uncovering the decades-long global impacts of forever chemicals? None of these struggles are over, but each of these people chose and are choosing courage over inaction. Even though our broken ways of relating to each other and our planet are colossal and overwhelming, each of them demonstrate that we can have nothing less than a far horizon beyond our lifetime's ripple effect vision of the actions that we take. Each of these people strove and are striving to live as true and mature human beings, to embrace that sacred potential that lives in all of us, to be vessels where hope for a future that might look something more like the love and dignity for which God created us becomes possible. That is what Paul speaks to in his letter to the Romans. That potential in all of us to give of our whole beings, heart, mind, and strength to the great Spirit as a living offering. To allow ourselves to be changed from the inside out in the way a caterpillar is changed into a butterfly. To act as midwives of courage, people who tend to the truth that none of our acts of compassionate defiance are ever wasted inside God's promise to be with us and moving through us always. In this moment, our world is crying out for us to have courage like the women of Exodus, to have courage like the community leaders who are working in every corner of the world every day, putting their lives on the line for a future worth fighting for. We need to recognize how our own humble power can have a cascading impact upon the future through even the smallest actions that we take. We need to remember that just like Pharaoh miscalculated the midwives and the power of women to mobilize a movement against his cruel regime, the powers that be right here and right now miscalculate us and the power of the human spirit to rise up again and again. Many of you may know the lawyer, Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy, and in whose own words has dedicated his life to helping the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. There's a moment in his book where he describes meeting Rosa Parks and telling her about his vision. It reads, quote, "Rosa Parks turned to me sweetly and asked, 'Now, Brian, tell me who you are and what you're doing.' I looked at Miss Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she smiled and nodded at me. I then gave Miss Parks my rap. 'Yes, ma'am. Well, I have a law project called the Equal Justice Initiative, and we're trying to help people on death row. We're trying to stop the death penalty, actually. We're trying to do something about prison conditions and excessive punishment. We want to free people who've been wrongly convicted. We want to end unfair sentences in criminal cases and stop racial bias in criminal justice.' Miss Parks leaned back, smiling. 'Ooh, honey, all that's going to make you tired, tired, tired.' We all laughed. I looked down, a little embarrassed. Then Miss Carr leaned forward and put her finger on my face and talked to me just like my grandmother used to talk to me. She said, 'That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave.' I wonder if we all looked inside ourselves and touched that place where our deepest hope lives. Where would we be called to be brave, brave, brave? Surely we cannot do it all, and thank God for that. But we can do something, and that something might matter more than we can ever possibly know. Because like Moses and Shiphrah and Puah and Yochebed and Rosa and Emily, and all the countless people who have dedicated their lives to trying to make a difference for the good of all of us, our small acts of courage and compassion flow into something far greater than our own lives. So today, may we trust in that current that Yochebed set Moses' basket upon. May we trust in the God who shows us that there is always the possibility of freedom and deliverance and healing and hope, if only, in the words of poet Amanda Gorman, we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Amen.